History can be found anywhere, even in your own backyard. So join us as we search the land, looking for the stories that helped shape this nation. Come on the porch, grab a drink, and join us for a little bit of history from the homestead. Hey there, history buffs, and welcome to this episode of the History from the Homestead podcast. I am your host, Thomas Carroll, and today we are going to be talking about Arlington National Cemetery. See, I'm already tongue-twisted. And I am joined by Dr. Allison S. Finklestein. Allison serves as the senior historian at Arlington National Cemetery. She earned her Ph.D. in U.S. history from the University of Maryland at College Park, where she also studied historic preservation. Her first book, Forgotten Veterans, Invisible Memorials, How American Women Commemorated the Great War, 1917 through 1945, was published by the University of Alabama Press in 2021 and released in paperback in September of 2023. It won the Mid-Atlantic Regional Archives Conference's 2022 Arline Custer Memorial Award for Best Book. From 2017 to 2018, the Arlington County Board appointed her as the chair of the Arlington World War I Commemoration Task Force. So, Allison, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to connect with you and your listeners.
Yes, and everybody, I'm sure everybody's familiar with Arlington National Cemetery, but probably not a lot of people are familiar with the history before it was a cemetery, well before it was a cemetery. And we go all the way back to George Washington times, basically. So, and it was George Washington Custis was the original, well, I shouldn't say original landowner. It was the Native Americans are actually the original landowners. But so what was George Washington Custis's connection to our first president?
Thank you. I'm really glad you mentioned the indigenous people because it's important to really start off any discussion about the Arlington property with the fact that there was some kind of indigenous occupation there. And the historical and archaeological record is a little bit scarce, so I won't get into it in a lot of detail, but we do have some evidence of Native American occupation. And then the history from the United States point of view really comes into play with George Washington Parke Custis. So George Washington Parke Custis was the grandson of Martha Washington and the step-grandson of our nation's first president, George Washington. And George Washington and Martha Washington really raised George Washington Parke Custis. They served as his parents and really had a major impact on his life. George Washington Parke Custis eventually inherited land from his biological father that is today the Arlington property. And after he inherited this land, he decided to turn it into his family's home. Using the labor of enslaved African Americans, he had a large house built on the top of the hilltop overlooking the Potomac River. That today is, of course, Arlington House. And he raised his family there, but he also intended for this large neoclassical mansion to act as a living memorial to George Washington. He was very enamored with his step grandfather and wanted to ensure that his memory would be passed on. And even today, if you're across the river in Washington, D.C., in Georgetown, on Memorial Bridge, or maybe the Kennedy Center rooftop, you can look out and very clearly see Arlington House. So you get a sense of how prominent it has always been and how it could be used as Parke Custis intended to memorialize George Washington. Today, the Arlington House Historic Site is actually run by the National Park Service, not the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army runs Arlington National Cemetery, and the Park Service has basically an island of land that they own that comprises the Arlington House Historic Site within the larger boundary of Arlington National Cemetery. So I really encourage your listeners to check out the National Park Service's resources about Arlington House. And if you come to Arlington, go up, visit the house, visit the enslaved quarters, learn about the story of the people who lived there, the people who were enslaved there, and how that property functioned until the eve of the Civil War.
Yeah, and it's that is the one almost black cloud that hangs over, because we're going to talk about the enslaved people quite significantly throughout this, which, because we're moving into the Civil War. It was we're just going to mention it briefly. We don't need to dive deep into it, but it uh, Confederate General Lee was married to uh, Miss Custis, Mary Ann, and so it's had a significant black history, if you will, probably lack of a better word, but it's a dark history for Arlington, no doubt.
Yeah, I think it's important to really specify for your audience that Robert E. Lee never owned the home or the property. George Washington Parke Custis passed it down to his daughter, Mary Anna Randolph Custis Lee, who did marry Robert E. Lee, so she was the owner. And Robert E. Lee and Mary did raise their family there. Robert E. Lee had many interactions, some of them very negative, as other historians have written, with the enslaved people on that property, but he never actually owned the property, which is an important distinction to make.
Yes.
I also just want to mention, if we're talking about the narrative that the National Park Service shares about Arlington House, out of respect for my colleagues there, they're portraying the narrative in a much more balanced way now. And they're really talking about the lives of the enslaved as well as the lives of the Lee and Custis family. And one example of that is actually related to Mary and Robert E. Lee themselves, because they were married in the parlor of Arlington House. But about 10 years prior, Mary's enslaved black half sister was also married in that parlor. Mariah Syphax married Charles Syphax in that same parlor, and she was a daughter of George Washington Parke Custis, who was conceived with an enslaved woman. So we have a very parallel, very emotionally deep story there that I really hope people will go to the house to explore.
That's that is interesting. I did not know that. That's something new I learned already today. that uh, that's almost wild. Um, but now, the U.S. Army troops had occupied Arlington in early 1861, and
Yes, yes.
that's where its history really starts to take off, in my personal opinion.
Right. So, again, if you ever have the opportunity to go to Washington, D.C., and look out across the river at Arlington House and Arlington National Cemetery, the U.S. Army's reasoning for seizing that land will become obvious very quickly. So it's situated high on a hilltop, which is strategically important for military purposes, and Robert E. Lee surely knew this. Civil War era artillery could range from the top of that hilltop to any of the federal era government buildings that were in Washington, D.C. at the time. So, no matter whose side Robert E. Lee chose to support, the U.S. Army would have had to occupy that property because they were busy building a series of fortifications to encircle Washington, D.C. and protect it during the Civil War. And indeed, this is exactly what happens. In the spring of 1861, the U.S. Army comes in, seizes the property after the Lee family had left, and builds at least 3 major fortifications on the land. One of them today is now Fort Myer, Joint Base Myer Henderson Hall, which is still in existence and can trace its origins back to the Civil War. So that strategic importance of the estate is really important. It was not taken originally for a cemetery, it was taken to build those fortifications.
That's yeah, exactly. And if anybody is a Civil War history buff like I am, you realize at the openings of the Civil War there was incredible pressure around Washington D.C. by the Confederate Army of Manassas and everything. So it was very vital that they hold somewhat of an advantage.
Exactly. Exactly. And the National Park Service has many of these fortifications that are preserved around Washington, D.C. It's called the Civil War Fortifications of Washington. They're really fascinating. If you ever have a chance to check them out, you can see the remnants of them really within viewshed of the nation's capital. So it's pretty cool.
Now, another really important part of Arlington was Freedman's Village, which is the one I really want to focus on a lot as well as myself because it's another thing you probably didn't realize from Arlington if you haven't read into the history.
Yes, thank you for bringing it up because that's really the next part of the story of the Arlington property's evolution. So, starting in 1863, the U.S. Army used the Arlington property not just for fortifications, but also for a temporary settlement for formerly enslaved people. So, as the Civil War continued on, enslaved people were coming up from the South trying to escape to U.S. lines. They were trying to seize their own freedom. And this essentially created a refugee problem for the Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia area. These people were wartime refugees in every sense of the word. They had no property, they had no income, they had no way to support themselves, and they were very much in danger during the war. So the US government realized eventually that they had to do something about this, and they started to establish freedmen's villages, also called contraband camps, around the area. And there's a history of these throughout Virginia as well as some other places. So the one at Arlington was not the only one, but it did become somewhat special because it was intended to be like a model community to demonstrate how these refugee settlements could function in a successful and positive way, with the goal being to help these people transition from enslavement to freedom. One of the stories I really love sharing with visitors is that Sojourner Truth actually spent time in 1864, I believe, at the Arlington Freedmen's Village, working there, trying to help teach skills to the residents. So it's really a fascinating part of the property's history, especially because even though it was intended to be temporary, it thrived so much. There were churches, schools, homes for the elderly, that it actually continued long past whenever the federal government intended it to. And there evolved after the Civil War a back and forth between the government and the residents. The residents wanted to stay, the government wanted them off the property. There were a lot of people advocating on behalf of the residents. Eventually, by 1900, the entire village was dismantled and everybody was gone from the property. But many of the families who had established roots at Freedman's Village remained in the Arlington area. Many of them still have descendants today that are either in the Arlington area or involved with this larger community, and it really has a lasting legacy on Arlington County, including this national level importance of how the US government was really trying to figure out what to do with enslaved people and how to navigate that transition.
Do we know approximately how many had lived at the village there at Arlington?
I don't have a number off the top of my head, but there's a great map from the Library of Congress that shows the village and the houses, and there were dozens of houses. I haven't counted them. In fact, you're making me think that maybe one day I should magnify that image on my computer and see if I can count the individual lots. But it was a fairly sizable community.
And for anybody who's interested, to the viewers, I will share a link of that on the Library of Congress website. I actually looked at it and I didn't count it either.
Well, I think you've given me a homework assignment, so I
And
can
there you
I can
go.
add that to my to-do list.
For my viewers, maybe that should be their homework
That's
assignment. They
great.
should put in the heavy lifting.
And then
Um,
they can send it over to us. But yeah, it's a really fascinating image as well because if you orient it correctly, and you do an overlay of the cemetery, you can get a sense of where it actually was. And I would also encourage your listeners. We did a webinar in February of this year with the National Archives about Freedman's Village in collaboration with a member of the descendant community. And in that video, we actually show where and how the village was oriented in terms of what's at Arlington National Cemetery today. So that's free, it's online through the National Archives. You can watch it at any time.
We'll definitely have to share a link for that as well. I have not seen that video either. Um, why did the federal government decide to dismantle the village? Because I have seen pictures of it. When you look at pictures, it was a well-established community. It wasn't a tent city.
Exactly.
It was well established, just like any town that we have now.
Yes, so it was always intended to be temporary from the outset, and the federal government didn't realize what kind of a community would begin to thrive there. But as Arlington National Cemetery was started in 1864, and I think we'll probably come back to that origin story, so I'll leave it there for now. Eventually, the cemetery became more of a place where veterans wanted to be buried, and land became more and more scarce, so that land was needed for the expansion of the cemetery.
Yeah, and that's a great segue into Arlington as a cemetery, um, and how and why it was selected. And do we know who the first was to be buried there?
Yes, we do. So I'll talk about him. His name was William Crispin, but I want to go back just a little bit to 1864, which was a critical period in the Civil War. You have Grant's overland campaign, you have a very desperate situation for the wounded, the sick, and the dying soldiers from both of the armies. And Washington, D.C. was inundated with service members who were dying from both disease and from battle wounds, particularly from that overland campaign. So there was a problem that the U.S. Army was faced with. They were running out of burial space. They were running out of burial space in the Soldiers' Home National Cemetery in Washington, D.C., which today is called Soldiers and Airmen's Home National Cemetery and is also run by our organization. They were running out of space in Alexandria National Cemetery. So by May of 1864, the Army decided to use the land that had been occupied by the U.S. Army at Arlington as a burial ground. And on May 13th, 1864, the first Civil War fatality was taken to Arlington for burial, and his name was William Crispin from Pennsylvania. He died of disease in a Washington, D.C. hospital. And he's buried in what is today called Section 27, even though it's the first section of the cemetery. And it's very much located on the lower lying land of Arlington. It is not anywhere near Arlington House. So the first burials that were brought to Arlington were placed there in what was eventually called the lower cemetery, away from the house. The house at that time was used as offices and barracks for the U.S. Army. Those soldiers did not want to be burying their comrades near where they were living. And if you actually come out to the site and go look around Section 27, which I encourage people to do, you get a real sense of that topography and the placement of that first burial section.
Yeah, and that makes sense because embalming stuff and techniques that we have today did not exist. It's
Exactly.
grave sites were not known to be pleasant places during that time,
No.
And not to mention some of the folks had traveled quite a distance already, having died in the various parts of the country we were fighting. Um, and it was also around this time when the federal government of, officially acquired the property.
Well, not quite. So the story of
Okay.
the property acquisition, it's rather complicated, but it takes us to after the Civil War. Um, Robert E. Lee's oldest son sued the federal government, saying that it had been taken without going through proper processes, and that case went all the way up to the Supreme Court by 1882. He was successful, and in 1883, the U.S. Army purchased the property from Robert E. Lee's eldest son.
I see. And that's almost one of those, again, my personal opinion. Sometimes to the victors go the spoils. That's that's how it goes sometimes too. And it's very glad they did because it is a beautiful place. I visited I haven't visited recently. I do need to come back now. That's my homework assignment is coming back for a visit.
I recommend
Um,
the fall or the spring, not August.
yes, yeah, yeah. um, and we also wanted to talk about too the Arlington National Cemetery education program. Um, that is something I'm not 100% familiar with, so that I will let you plug that, please.
No, thank you. It's actually relatively new. It's only been in existence since about 2020, 2021, and I know a lot of people just haven't been able to get back to traveling at normal speeds since the pandemic. So the education program, it's really aimed at several different audiences. It's aimed at students and teachers of all ages from elementary, middle, and high school. It's aimed at families who are coming with small children. It's aimed at homeschool communities as well as lifelong learners. And I think, Thomas, that your audience would be in the lifelong learner category for the most part, right? Adults who maybe are not enrolled in a school or a program but are really interested in learning. And I mention that because this isn't just for kids and teachers, it's meant to basically take the experts at Arlington National Cemetery and put them in your pocket so that when you come to visit in person or virtually, you can learn as much as you have the time and walking stamina to learn about the cemetery. So we have a lot of different modules that focus on history, but also other topics. So I'm going to talk mostly about the history modules, but I do want to give a mention to the other topics. We have modules on our memorial arboretums. So we are a certified memorial arboretum. So if you're interested in plants, in horticulture, in landscape design and trees, you can come to Arlington and learn about all of that. We have science, technology, math modules, all sorts of different topics that relate to people's interests. But for the history side of things, for example, if you want to come and learn about Freedman's Village, you can do that using our African American history module. It provides lifelong learner documents with primary sources. It includes walking tours so that you can actually download that tour or print it out, whatever you're comfortable with, and guide yourself around the cemetery while learning about the different sites. Our office, the cemetery's history office, we do public tours and programs. We try to do them in the spring and the fall when people want to come out with us and the weather is nice, but we realize that we can't be everywhere and there's so many people that we serve. We want them to have the opportunity to do independent learning. So that's what these education modules are really aimed at doing. We have World War II module, military medicine, women's history just came out, military technology, military intelligence. I think we have over 12 or 15 out there right now. So they're free for everybody to use. You can use it when you come here, or you can use it as a virtual program as well.
That's great because the best way to learn is hands on like that. Um,
Exactly.
that's what kind of got me interested in history is seeing as opposed to just reading,
Me
and
too.
that's really great. I kind of looked through it a little bit before we did the show, and I will share a link because I urge everybody to check that out.
Oh,
Um,
thank you. Thank you.
and we should. I want to talk briefly too about visiting Arlington because that's kind of a segue what you were just talking about is what would somebody expect visiting Arlington? Tough
Oh,
question. That's a
oh my
very tough
goodness.
question.
It's
Um,
all going to depend on your interests, but I mean, I guess for the first thing I can say is that most visitors will start at our Welcome Center. And at the Welcome Center, we have an exhibit space where you can learn about the history of the cemetery. And right now, our exhibit focuses on the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. We also have a beautiful photograph exhibit from our contract photographer that features amazing images of cemetery staff at work. So you can take in that exhibit space and use it as a place to orient your visit. And then you have a couple options. You can go off on your own and you can walk around the cemetery, or you can purchase a ticket for a tram ride that will enable you to basically hop on and hop off. If walking our 639 acres is not for you and you don't like a lot of hills, the tram and trolley may be the right approach. But if you are a hiker and you like to walk, that's the best way, I think, to see the cemetery. And then, I mean, there's of course a couple things that you can't miss if it's your first visit, such as the grave of President John F. Kennedy and the changing of the guard at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, where we also have a small exhibit just upstairs from the tomb where you can learn more about the tomb's history and see artifacts related to it. So those are the two major must-sees. But then I would encourage people, look at the education programs walking tours and see which themes really match your interests. Do you have someone with you who's really interested in the environment? You could pick and choose some of those stops and make sure that you see them on your tour. If you want to learn about women's rights and suffrage leaders, you can actually visit the graves of suffrage leaders who are buried at Arlington National Cemetery. One example, who I love to talk about, is Anna Kelton Wiley, who was actually imprisoned at the workhouse in Lorton, Virginia, after being arrested for protesting the White House. So we have some amazing stories that may not necessarily seem like the obvious ones at Arlington National Cemetery, but if you have an interest related to the U.S., I'm pretty confident that we can find you a stop at Arlington that will match that interest. That doesn't narrow it down a lot for you.
And I know some of my viewers are probably, when they listen to this, are going to get mad. I'm going to let a little cat out of the bag, hopefully. You'll notice we did not talk about the Tomb of the Unknown. You mentioned it, we did not talk about it. That's because we are hoping to do a separate show focused solely on that. So there, I don't want anybody messaging me and yelling at me about missing that. So hopefully we're going to have a separate show as a companion to this.
And we have a lot of resources about the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. So I think it'd be great if you can talk to a tomb guard for that episode, but one of us from the history office can talk to you about the history as well. But we have an entire section of our website that has webinars, videos, a commemorative publication for free about the tomb. So Thomas, you made the right call, because if you get me started talking about the tomb, you're not going to get me to stop.
Yeah, well, it's a work in progress, so we may talk about it. Hopefully, we may talk to a tomb guard. It's still an up in the air thing, but I have to add that so nobody's yelling at me about that.
Agreed. Agreed.
And I want to say here, before we close out, because we had, time was an issue, but I want to say to everybody that goes to please remember, this is in fact a cemetery. It is, in fact, a cemetery full of heroes who gave the ultimate price. And I would like, if you would join me for a second, I'd like to honor them with a moment of silence. And Allison, I thank you for joining me about this. It was interesting to talk about, and we probably, if we'd really got into depth on everything, we probably would be here till midnight at the very least. So I thank you so much for joining me. And everybody, remember, go visit Arlington. That's what you have to do.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And I certainly hope that folks come out to visit or follow us at Arlington NATL on social media. We do a lot of virtual programs as well. So if you can't travel to Virginia and DC, that's okay. You can still participate in many of our programs and learn from us.
Also, too, another homework assignment for my viewers. We mentioned at the beginning of the show, your book, they have to go buy it and read it, including me. I have not read it yet. So, so again, thank you for joining me.
Oh, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this.
Thanks to everybody for listening. Remember, if you like the show, you can share it with all your friends. We can be found on all the major podcast players. We can be found on Facebook. And you can also find us and catch the show notes at historyfromthehomestead.com.